Ready Player One is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my whole entire life. I don't know how Steven Spielberg, who has proven he can make really great movies that are respected art, like Schindler's List, Catch Me If You Can, Jurassic Park, and Minority Report, can make a movie that just feels like it's farted into existence. I don't even know why he wanted to make this movie. Speaking of that, why was this movie even made? If you guys don't know, this movie was adapted from the book with the same title, and it is one of the worst things I have ever read. After I was done reading, I was just shocked that somebody can write something so awful and people can really like the book. Like, a lot of people really love this book for some reason. I have so many notes and just things highlighted that I think are really bad. Like, this is one of the worst things I've ever read. I think I'm gonna read some of my absolute favorite quotes from the book. So the real jaw-dropping news that January morning, the news that had everyone from Toronto to Tokyo crapping in their cornflakes. Artemis's body was also somewhat unusual. In the Oasis, you usually saw one of two body shapes on female avatars. The absurdly yet wildly popular supermodel frame, or the top-heavy wasp-waist porn star physique, which even looked less natural in the Oasis than it did in the real world. But Artemis's frame was short and Rubenesque. The DeLorean came outfitted with a non-functioning flux capacitor. I'd made several additions to equipment and appearance. First, I'd installed an artificially onboard computer named Kit into the dashboard along with a matching red Knight Rider scanner and the DeLorean's grille. Finally, to complete my 80s super vehicle, I'd slapped Ghostbusters logo on each of the DeLorean's dual wiring doors. The added personalized plate read Ecto88. I think this is honestly probably my favorite quote in the entire book. I would argue that masturbation is the human animal's most important adaptation, the very cornerstone of our technological civilization. Our hands evolved to grip tools, all right, including your own, you see. Thinkers, inventors, and scientists are usually geeks, and geeks have a harder time getting laid than anyone. Without the built-in sexual release value provided by masturbation, it's doubtful that early humans would have mastered the secrets of fire or discovered the wheel. And you can bet that Galileo and Newton would have never made their discoveries if they hadn't first been able to clear their heads by slapping their salami. You know what? I take back everything negative I said about this book. This book is amazing. I love it. If you can't tell already, this book is incredibly cringeworthy. This book is also incredibly misogynistic, and I'm not the type of person to throw that word around often. And if you think I'm wrong and this book is just a clever satire, watch this video by the author and I think it will change your mind.
This misogynist He-Man woman hater porn. I want porno movies that are made with guys like me in mind. Guys who know that the sexiest thing in the world is a woman who is smarter than you are. You can have the whole cheerleading squad. I want the girl in the tweed skirt and the horn-rimmed glasses. Betty Finnebowski, the valedictorian. Oh yes! First I want to copy her trig homework, and then I want to make mad, passionate love to her for hours and hours, until she reluctantly asks if we can stop because she doesn't want to miss Battlestar Galactica.
Honestly, out of all the really great books you can adapt in a movie, why Ready Player One? It doesn't really make that much sense to me. I think the only reason that this book was even adapted is because we live in an age now where we kind of tribute the 80s a lot, but that seems like the only reason that they would make this into a movie. I don't even really know who the book is for and who would I recommend it to. It doesn't really seem like the book is for anyone. I think the only people who may like it are the people who are very nostalgic for the 80s. But that element is very pandering in the book and the movie, so I don't know if those people would really enjoy it either. I don't know if teenagers would enjoy it because they wouldn't really get all the references, and that's kind of the appeal of the book, I guess. I kind of thought that the filmmakers were kind of doomed to fail. It didn't really seem like you can make a really good movie out of this book. It's either really hard or straight up impossible to make this book into a really good movie because it's kind of broken from its core. The book completely fails on every level, and it fails at everything it's trying to do. Part of it's kind of trying to be a very simple romance story, and it completely fails at that. The book tries to be a tribute to the 80s, but it also fails at that. I think the only really redeeming qualities about the book is some loose ideas, but they don't really do anything with it, which I'll get into later. I honestly wish this movie was a little bit more of an accurate representation to what the book is, because I want to see them do some of the shit that's in the book. It would honestly be really funny to see the main character quote war games into a movie. I wonder how they're gonna pull that off. I get why they changed a lot about the book, because it would be really weird to adapt. There's a lot of really weird and creepy stuff pertaining to the romance between Parzival and Artemis. If those elements were adapted into a movie, it could really put people off, and I really understand why. Now there's a sequel to this book, and if it's just as bad as the first one, I might do a separate video on that because I already pre-ordered it. I think the more important question to ask than why did they adapt this book into a movie is why Steven Spielberg wanted to make it. I honestly really don't see what he saw in the script for this movie, because the script in this movie is horrible and it's just really generic. It doesn't really feel like it's something he personally wanted to make. It kind of feels like something people expect him to make. I think he saw the opportunity to be very revolutionary in this movie, and I think it maybe superseded the script itself. To a certain extent, I understand that feeling that he had. When you think about it, it's a really great opportunity as a filmmaker to adapt this grand and vast world, and with technology, we could probably pull it off today. But there's to a point where you kind of have to ask yourself as a filmmaker, is being revolutionary more important, or is telling a good story more important? I highly doubt he saw really anything special in the script, because when you really break it down, it's just a really generic story. Honestly, the only way to make this book into a really good movie is to completely change everything, then maybe develop some of the ideas that the book had that were really good. The book is basically a terrible romance story with some really pandering 80s tributes, with the plot that absolutely makes no sense at all. Speaking of that, the plot. Sometimes the plot in a movie can get so predictable it becomes really funny, and the plot of this movie is really predictable. I knew every step that this movie was going to take 5 minutes before it even happened. A lot of this movie really heavily relies on narration and exposition. It's so lazy to me. A lot of the things in this movie that Wade Watts narrated, you can show in a visual way. I don't think narration in a movie is inherently bad, it just has to be used really well. I consider narration a useful tool in filmmaking. It could help you get into the character's head and give off important information. I only get really annoyed by it when it's just lazy to me and it's just the characters giving off exposition. There's only narration in the first 20 minutes and the last like 5 minutes in this movie. Like I said, a lot of these things you can show in a visual way that's really creative. Especially something like the Oasis, it should speak for itself. It's this grand world where you can be anything. The only limits in reality is your own imagination, but I guess the writers don't have a lot of imagination. Also, a lot of the characters' backstories are given through narration, but these things aren't really developed, but I'll get to that later. I'm really emphasizing this issue because I kind of feel like it's wasted time. I think the plot in this movie is just very unfocused, and it should focus on the things that are very important as these characters, but they're poorly developed. I will give this movie credit, like the opening scene where it shows different people on the Oasis. There's a lady on a pole, there's another guy boxing. It's a little bit creative, and you could kind of tell there's a director there. That's the only part of the movie that kind of gives information in a clever way that's shown visually, but the other parts are just kind of lazy. It's only like 5 seconds to the movie, so it's not really worth anything in the big context of it. Also, another problem with the plot in this movie is that nothing makes any fucking sense. I'm usually not a person that likes to nitpick little mistakes in filmmaking because that's going to happen from time to time. But in this movie, those little things really add up and the film gives me nothing else to chew on, so of course those things are going to stand out to me. Okay, I'm going to be like CinemaSins right now and nitpick the shit out of this movie. Logos. The title card in this scene is only like 5 seconds long. Come on, Spielberg, have it for 5 more seconds. You can do better than that. Olivia Cooke has her shirt on in this scene. Okay, enough with that stupid gag. Let's get on to the movie now. First of all, throughout this movie, people are shown to use treadmills and stuff like that, but how are people able to jump around and shit? Wouldn't things happening in the real world conflict with the Oasis? Like if somebody's running in the Oasis, they're also running in the real world. Wouldn't they run into a wall or something eventually? Wade Watts is shown to have this suit on where he could feel anything in the Oasis, and I just have to ask myself, why would you want to get that? What advantage will that give you? They show a trailer in the movie saying that the characters want every advantage that you can get, but what advantage do you have? The only person that has an advantage over you is your enemy. They could just easily exploit that against you. Also, another item in this universe is that there's this nuke that can blow up the whole planet or something, or the entire sector that you're on. Why the hell would someone put that in the game, and wouldn't someone just grind up all their gear and shit just to get that item? That's another huge issue with this movie, that it doesn't know how the gamer mindset works. There would be people littered in this world just messing up shit just for the hell of it. Some people just want to watch the world burn. That's like one of the number one things that happens in online gaming, people just messing around. It just makes no sense to me. There's not at least one person in this world that just wants to destroy everything for no reason. Like when Wade Watts finds finds the first key, people just come up to him and congratulate him. No, people would be trying to kill him. People are assholes. Especially when you have this big contest that every player wants to solve. Of course people are going to try to kill him and take the key. The whole mystery aspect of this movie where they have to find the 3 keys also doesn't make any sense at all, but I will give it some credit. In this movie, Wade Watts actually has to look behind James Halliday's personality. He actually has to find out about him as a person and not just quote Monty Python. That's not even the joke, he actually has to do that in the book. It's still stupid and doesn't make any sense, but it's a little bit better in the movie. I really don't understand how people haven't figured out this by now. There are so many nerds just invested in this game. I don't know how people wouldn't have figured out like the first day it happened. Like James Halliday gives the most obvious clue in the world in the place where he told people to look. I don't know how people haven't had the idea to go backwards. I know a lot of people have said this already, but the first thing you do in Mario Kart or something is try to go backwards. A major conflict in this movie is to destroy Ioi and beat them, and also that doesn't make any sense. How is this corporation just able to keep people captive for this long? You could have the easiest win for a lawsuit ever. Samantha gets captured in this movie. She can easily go like, hey, that douchebag Sorrento held me captive. Then the cops will be like, oh, okay, and then Sorrento would be in a jail cell instantly. Honestly, I could ignore little nitpicks like that if the film gives me something else to chew on and distracts me from that. This movie really gives me nothing else to offer, so of course those little things will stand out. Honestly, when you think about this world, it just crumbles in an instant when you give some thought to it. Like for example, a lot of the Marvel movies have things that don't really make any sense, but I could easily ignore those because those movies are actually fun and has very likable characters. This movie doesn't focus on that, it just focuses on stupid references. Speaking of that, references. There's this new trend in Hollywood where they just reference things for no reason, especially the 80s, and it's grown more popular in the past few years. Just referencing things for no reason really irritates me. I think they take it to a whole new level in this movie and it really bogs down the movie. I feel like the reference in this movie really have no purpose to them. A lot of the references in this movie just evolve into, oh look, it's Jason Voorhees, oh look, it's the DeLorean, oh look, it's Harley Quinn, oh look, it's Goro. Oh wow, do you remember that? Isn't that something you recognize? Isn't that cool? Jesus Christ, I wish somebody would do a fatality on me right now. This movie is the equivalent of some nerd going like, I have seen every Star Trek series, I have seen every Star Wars movie, haha, beat me up, Scotty. How the references are portrayed in this movie feels like someone that isn't passionate about what they're referencing. It just really doesn't feel like this movie is made by someone who loves these things. It just kind of feels like it's trying to pander to a bunch of screaming idiots. Like for example, they have the Iron Giant in a battle scene which goes against the entire point of that particular character.
But I think the pop cultural reference that I liked the most, because, and I think Ty was going to agree with this, we both agree with this, is the Iron Giant.
I would definitely agree.
Yeah.
I have no doubt in my mind Steven Spielberg is probably passionate about these things that he's referencing in this movie. It just really doesn't come across that way in this movie because they're so lazily presented. I think the only scene that I really like in this movie that is kind of referencing something else is the Shining scene. I thought it was kind of well done. They actually added a subtle film grain to the scene. I was thinking to myself, wow, this scene isn't terrible. Then they made it terrible. I wonder if H looked inside another room, then he would find a guy getting his dick sucked by another dude in a bear costume. I think this concept is at its worst when Sorrento is trying to manipulate Wade Watts by just referencing stuff. Sorrento feels like Steven Spielberg and the writers are just feeding him references for the stupid audience. It's funny how the writer of the book didn't realize how stupid this was, but these characters are having nostalgia for someone else's nostalgia. Wouldn't people be obsessed with culture that's currently going on in the world? The characters in this movie don't feel like actual nerds, and it doesn't really feel like they actually love these things. People who are actually nerds don't just stop to explain what they're referencing, which they do in this movie, and it's kind of irritating to me.
That's what I like about you, Nolan. You never lick. You bite straight to the chocolatey center of the Tootsie Pop. Remember that old commercial with the owl?
Well, thank you, TJ Miller. I didn't know that before. Thank you for that information. I think that's why I feel so disconnected from these references, because it feels like the characters are also disconnected in a way. In the book or the movie, we never get that much of an understanding why Halliday loves these things. There's a little bit of him kind of wanting to escape reality, but that's really it. A lot of the characters in this movie just talk about things in a very shallow way, and it feels really pandering to me. Let me get this clear, I'm not saying you can't tribute things that you love. A lot of my favorite filmmakers do that. Especially the 80s pop culture, there's a lot of great movies that came out in that era. A lot of my favorite movies came out in that era, and a lot of the things they tribute in this movie I actually really like. Even in other Steven Spielberg movies, he's tributed movies that he really likes. You could tell that he's very inspired by Alfred Hitchcock. I think the biggest example of an 80s tribute done well is definitely Stranger Things. You can tell that the Duffer Brothers were very inspired by Stephen King. Even the text in the intro is very similar. The difference between something like Stranger Things and this is that Stranger Things stands on its own. Stranger Things takes all these elements of what the Duffer Brothers really love and makes something entirely new out of it. Stranger Things has its own new, very interesting characters and its own sense of style. And most importantly, it stands on its own, and Ready Player One doesn't stand on its own as its own movie. When you take out all the nostalgia in this movie, it's really nothing when you think about it. Other apart than the 80s nostalgia and pop culture, all you really have is a generic story with really boring characters. Speaking of that, the characters. All the characters in this movie are really bad and poorly developed. Let's start with this block of wood known as Wade Watts. He is just a boring and generic dumb action hero. His only real purpose is to give exposition because the writers couldn't deliver it in a clever way. Everything that could be interesting about his character is brought up then immediately thrown away. He mentions that his parents died a while ago and he doesn't really seem to be affected by it. It's also the same thing when his aunt dies. They only have one scene together before she dies, and the film acts like we're supposed to care for some reason. I don't know how I'm supposed to care when the main character doesn't really care either. Also, the actor who plays Wade Watts is really bad in this movie, and he has some really bad line delivery.
Oh, yeah.
This character is never really given anything interesting. The only thing he really has in this movie is the romance with Artemis, and that is really bad. He has a crush on her just like any weird neckbeard on the internet that likes a girl that he doesn't even know. It's not as bad as it was in the book. Just like I said, the character is very misogynistic, and when he rejects her, he just harasses her for a lot of the book. The romance is a huge aspect in this movie, and it's really, really poorly developed. They only have like 2 scenes together before Wade Watts confesses his love to her. I do not know a single thing that these two characters like about each other except for Wade Watts thinking that she's hot, but that's really it. Then with Artemis, I really don't know what she sees in Wade Watts at all. Let's talk about Artemis now, because I think she's just as poorly written as Wade Watts is. She has somewhat of an interesting backstory where her father was forced to work with Ioi and he died. But just like Wade Watts' backstory, it's just mentioned then thrown away and it's never mentioned again in the whole entire movie. Also, another huge part of her character is that she says throughout the movie or like one scene that he'll be disappointed if he sees her in real life. It's just a stupid scene and it's very cliche and I couldn't help roll my eyes at it.
Be cool if we met up in the real world.
Now you'd be disappointed. This isn't what I really look like. This isn't.
I think this aspect is a tiny bit better in the book because they only meet at the end of the book. Also, there's a little bit of a subtle way they communicate that she's no longer insecure about herself anymore. Also, this movie has a really bad villain, Sorrento. I don't even really know what his motivation is. He's just a generic evil businessman, and he's not really intimidating at all. I think my favorite character in this movie is probably James Halliday, but that's only because Mark Rylance actually gives a pretty good performance. Mark Rylance has actually some subtle details to show that the character has Asperger's, and I actually appreciated that, but that's really it. I'll give credit where credit is due. I actually like that part of the movie. I think in this movie he unintentionally comes across as an asshole. There's a scene where Ogden Morrow is explaining to him the consequences of the Oasis, but he can't help himself but to reference stuff. He's not as bad as he was in the book, because in the book he would literally fire people if people weren't obsessed with the 80s just as much as he was. Also, his message of telling people to stay in reality because it's the only thing that's real is really poorly done in this movie and the book. This whole time this movie spent glorifying staying out of reality, then all of a sudden they just say, oh yeah, reality is good, by the way. To me, it feels really poorly communicated and goes against everything that was established earlier in the book and the movie. It's kind of like the writers changed the theme at the last second of the movie. Also, a lot of these side characters are really useless and could be killed off and it wouldn't really matter that much. H has an obviously modulated female voice in this movie. I just really love how they try to make it a big reveal, but the reveal is so obvious from the beginning of the movie. Also, Daito and Sho are really useless in this movie as well. It had a little bit more of a use in the book, and there's actually a point where Ioi throws Daito out of the window, I think. Honestly, when I read that, I thought it was really funny to me. Also, TJ Miller's in this movie, and he's really bad. All he does is just make shitty jokes the whole time. Like, there's this running gag where he has some neck problem or something. I don't even know what they try to do there.
To be honest, I think I need physical therapy because it's not
Wow, funny joke, TJ Miller. People need therapy when they're done with you, asshole. I think what's really frustrating about all these characters, if you think about it, they can be all really great characters that a lot of people can relate to. Like with Wade Watts, someone who's lived a really painful life and he doesn't really like it anymore being in reality, and then he goes to the Oasis. And maybe realizing throughout the story that trying to escape reality maybe wasn't the way to deal with his problems. Also with Artemis and her backstory, her being forced to do this competition. She also wants to prevent something that her happened to father to happen to nobody else ever again. Also a character that is very insecure about herself, and that could blossom into a really great relationship with Wade Watts. Those two characters are both very insecure about themselves, and they also both lost the only thing they love about reality. Also, Sorrento could be a really great villain, this huge businessman that's very powerful, and these characters can face a story that's way bigger than them. All these characters can go against this huge conglomerate and realize reality is a lot more important than personal greed about owning the Oasis. I think the idea of all these characters taking down this conglomerate is really ruined in this movie because the characters apparently live like 5 blocks away from each other. Also, James Halliday can be like a very fascinating character when you think about it. Someone who has lived a very harsh reality, creating this virtual world that he can go into forget that, then later has regrets in life. Also, Wade Watts can be a very great vessel for that message because him and James Halliday have lived very similar lives. I think that would be a really great and satisfying arc that Wade Watts learned from his mistakes. James Halliday can be a very tragic character, and if it was done better, you can really sympathize with him. I think that's what's so frustrating about these characters and just about this movie in general. Anything interesting that these characters can go through or any interesting backstory just kind of mentioned and thrown away. You basically have the blueprint here for very interesting and complex characters that a lot of people can relate to. Also, this conflict between Ioi and all of these characters can be very interesting, and it could be satisfying when this conglomerate is taken down finally. The book and the movie has potentially really interesting characters and also concepts, but they don't really use them properly in any interesting way. Speaking of that, has interesting concepts but doesn't use them. I think I'm going to talk about the book a little bit more in this part of the video because I think it's kind of important. The book and the movie have very interesting concepts, but unfortunately they don't do anything interesting with them. I think the absolute biggest wasted potential in the book and the movie is absolutely Ioi and Sorrento. Sorrento can be a very interesting and fascinating character. He can also serve as a really great villain presence. Sorrento can be a really great example to show how power and money corrupt people in a really bad way. Ioi can be a really great representation of an evil corporation if it was done well. In this movie, they just come off as really comical to me, and there's nothing really interesting with them. There's a scene in the movie where Ioi is trying to figure out how many ads you can fit in the Oasis without giving the player a seizure. First of all, that's the only kind of funny joke in the movie, and also you could introduce a really interesting concept there. You could actually do something really interesting with that, and something that would be really relevant towards today, especially with the gaming industry. You look at the gaming industry now, they are very predatory towards its consumers with microtransactions and bullshit like that. Probably explore consumerism in a very interesting way, but they don't really do anything with it in this movie, like I said. Also, the Oasis is very much wasted potential as well. If you think about it, this vast world where the player can be anything, you could really pull it off, especially in this day and age with the technology that we have. You can also use this as an opportunity to explore internet culture in a really clever way that other movies haven't really done yet. I think kind of having an exaggerated version of the internet can really bring attention to issues on the internet today, like how people act when they feel anonymous on the internet and it could reveal someone's character. Also about how we kind of hide a part of ourselves on the internet and how a lot of us are very insecure, but who we are in reality is what makes us who we are actually.
And you know, who you are in reality and what you are makes you beautiful. and I don't care what it is. That's like, for me, the bigger.
A lot of us use the internet to escape reality in some way. I think James Halliday can be a really good vessel for the message while escaping reality is okay from time to time, but then it could get to a level where it's way too far and we could kind of lose sight of ourselves of who we actually are. We can also lose sight of what's going on in the real world as well. You can also explore the paradox of how we can connect with anyone on the internet, but we're all so alone. In the book, it's kind of explained a little bit more than it is in the movie that the real world is in kind of a disarray, but the book barely mentions it like once in the story and they don't really follow up on it. But I think that's really interesting, like the whole stacks and everything in this dystopian world can be really interesting if you do some writing and some world building. Just kind of feels like Ernest Cline tried to give legitimacy to his book and just mentioning these serious issues. It didn't really seem like he cared about these issues, it kind of just seemed like he wanted to mention them. The book felt like more of a vessel just so he could reference things that he loves from the 80s and show off how many things he's seen from the 80s. I think I have the same problem with this movie and the book that I do with 13 Reasons Why. That show just kind of merely mentions these serious issues but doesn't really develop them. I think you can explore a lot of these issues in a very clever and concise way. I think this book can kind of be an interesting miniseries maybe, or maybe just a movie, but just kind of pick one of the issues that I mentioned so far. Then you can really explore that with really great characters that we love and relate to. I don't mind what this movie is going for and the route they kind of took. They kind of wanted to make a simple action movie that you don't really have to think about and that you could just have fun with, and if they did that properly, I would be perfectly fine with it. But I don't know, in this movie they kind of introduce things that could be interesting, and when you don't really develop on it, I kind of want more of that. I'm sorry if I kind of went on a tangent here because I actually like to talk about the text itself and not just suggest what it should be. Here there's actually interesting and fun, exciting concepts that you can really explore very well. And I think Steven Spielberg could have been the perfect director for this movie. If I think the script was better maybe and the action scenes were better, this could have been a really great movie. Speaking of that, the action scenes. A lot of people who defend this movie say, well, at least the action scenes are good, but I don't really agree that much. I think the race scene is kind of okay. I think the sound design is actually really well done and the blocking is really great, and Steven Spielberg is really good at doing that, so of course that's very well done in this movie. I think a lot of the CGI is really bad in this movie, especially when it comes to character designs. Wade Watts' design looks like crap, Artemis looks like crap, H also looks like crap. I don't know, I think all the character designs look really bad in this movie. I just really don't like the look of this movie at all. It's a really ugly blue color palette. I think this movie is just kind of really ugly to look at. It's not the worst thing ever, but I just really don't like it. I think especially this is a problem in the final action scene in the movie. I think it just looks like total ass in my opinion. A scene like that should look very vibrant and colorful, but everything looks the same and I just really hate the look of it. Most of the time, I just really hate big battles where there's just a bunch of shit on screen. I think this kind of thing has been pulled off well in other movies, but here it really isn't. When you look at scenes like this that are really well done, in those movies there's a lot of gradual build up to these scenes, but in this movie it doesn't really feel like there's build up to these events. Also, it's really not satisfying when the characters win in the end, because first of all, they're really poorly developed. Also, there's just really no tension because this movie is so predictable. I already knew what was going to happen in the end. I never really felt excited what's going to happen next, and when you see a movie like Avengers Infinity War, you see why that scene is very well done. First of all, there's like 10 years worth of build up to that scene, and also there's a lot of characters that we really like and that we really care for, and that's why the ending of that movie is so effective. Also, on a technical level, it's way better done, and Thanos feels like a threat, and his CGI is actually very well rendered and well done. In this movie, it just doesn't feel like they utilize their technology very well to do something creative. They really do nothing special in this movie, and they have a lot of high budget, and it kind of feels like you see money burning. It's not as bad as something like Justice League, but it's still really bad. I wasn't really impressed with a single thing that happened in this movie. I never really felt like I was shown anything new in this movie. It just kind of feels like the same shit we've seen over and over again, just copy and pasted into this movie. I think that's why also this aspect aspect is very frustrating to me, because you can do a lot of really great things with the technology we have today, and especially with a filmmaker like Steven Spielberg. He is very experienced with special effects. He knows what he's doing. You see that in a lot of other movies that he's in. He uses his special effects in a really creative, well done way. Also, the real life segments in this movie are pretty bad. Not really bad, they're just kind of bland, and there's really nothing creative there. It's just so weird to me how Steven Spielberg can make a movie so poorly directed. He has made some of the greatest and most impressive film sequences of all time, but here he just really does nothing. I guess some scenes kind of look cool, but that's not really valuable to me. I know this is a weird thing to say, especially about Steven Spielberg, but it didn't really feel like there was a director there. I know I spent a lot of this video talking about Ready Player One, but I really want to talk about Steven Spielberg. I think in the past few years, it kind of feels like Steven Spielberg is kind of going through an identity crisis. This movie doesn't feel like it was directed by Steven Spielberg. It feels like someone who saw Steven Spielberg but didn't understand what made his movies special and why people connect with them so much. Kind of feels like Steven Spielberg kind of just focused on the effects and what you can do with them in this movie other than the actual script itself. I really don't see what he saw in this movie and see why he wanted to direct it. Kind of feels like the story was an afterthought in his mind. I feel that way about some of his recent films like the BFG. A lot of people have the idea that Steven Spielberg just makes dumb blockbusters, but that is far from the truth. He has made very challenging and smart movies about the atrocities of mankind and how it impacts the world, privacy and free will in a digital world, and what it means to be human. Even in his big blockbuster movies, there is so much to connect to. Even if it's sharks eating people, even if it's dinosaurs eating people, there is one thing that those movies have that Ready Player One doesn't have, and that's heart. And that's the biggest problem with this movie, is that it has no heart. This movie kind of feels like a movie that people who don't understand Spielberg is what people think he makes. A dumb, shallow, garbage movie that you're gonna forget in 20 minutes after you watch it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thank you for playing my game.
I've been so alone ever since I left the tribe. That's just how it goes, guess I like the lonely.